In a secure underground laboratory on the outskirts of Islamabad, a Chinese expert's scalpel meticulously cut open the last layer of armor on a BrahMos missile. On the Indian military officer's monitoring screen, the parameters instantly zeroed out. As Pakistan placed the remnants of 3 Indian divine artifacts on the dissection table, New Delhi's war machine began blaring a harsh malfunction alarm. On July 14, Pakistan publicly released footage of the dismantling for the first time. The cold glint of the BrahMos missile's Secr, the exposed circuits of the Storm Shadow missile's armor-piercing warhead, and the communication module of the Harop drone, held by tweezers, were all visible. What was particularly striking was Pakistan's proactive invitation to Chinese experts to participate in the dismantling alongside Pakistani specialists. China leads the world in electronic, communication, and radar technologies, and their participation in this dissection will allow them to fully grasp the core secrets of Indian weapons, enabling them to formulate highly targeted countermeasures. The U.S. has previously lamented that Western equipment, once seen by Chinese experts, reveals its secrets, leading to the development of superior products. This is the unique capability of Chinese experts. 3 of India's most advanced weapons, the BrahMos missile, the Storm Shadow cruise missile, and the Harop drone, all became Pakistani spoils of war in this aerial confrontation. The BrahMos missile is India's most prized hypersonic missile, considered by India as its ace for striking important targets in Pakistan. However, it was successfully intercepted and its relatively intact wreckage captured during this aerial engagement. It is reported that the cruise missile's radar and Secr are intact, making it highly valuable for research. Pakistan also provided the Storm Shadow missile for dismantling, a joint British-French development that played a significant role in the battlefield. Reportedly, Pakistan captured this missile in combat, and its armor-piercing warhead and infrared guidance components were found to be complete and undamaged. The Harop drone, heavily invested in by India, was also a key focus of Pakistan's public dismantling. Its communication module and main control unit became the primary research targets. In the heavily guarded dismantling site, the Chinese expert team operated with the precision of a delicate surgical procedure. As Chinese experts' sophisticated instruments penetrated the interiors of these nation-protecting artifacts that once brought India pride, a silent but deadly technical annihilation battle had begun. The electronic devices, guidance modules, and propulsion systems of these remnants were dissected one by one. The Indian military's last battlefield trump cards were completely exposed under the bright lights. Chinese experts are not only highly capable learners, but also possess profound research in relevant fields. They can not only discover the most direct technical equipment characteristics, but also deduce the essence through phenomena, uncovering the core operational mechanisms of India's key equipment. The GPS or INS composite guidance system of the Storm Shadow wreckage was completely extracted. This will allow China and Pakistan to find the key to countering the core guidance principles of this missile, thereby enabling targeted preventive measures. The AES-256 encryption link of the Harop drone was once considered unbreakable, but after dismantling and research by China and Pakistan, its fundamental principles can be uncovered, leading to basic countermeasures. Through the dismantling, it can be seen that India's indigenous pride, the BrahMos, developed over 30 years, is essentially still a copy of the Russian P-800 missile. The future warfare system will be characterized by even more pronounced unilateral crushing. The Indian military will find it even harder to fight in the next steps. Analysis by media outlets like the Times of India suggests that the intelligence value gained from dismantling the weapon remnants far exceeds imagination. China has not only obtained missile parameters, but also core secrets such as the Indian military's electronic warfare frequencies, radar signal characteristics, and encrypted communication rules. India is concerned that China will integrate the acquired data into air defense systems like the HQ-9, making it even more difficult for Indian missiles to penetrate in the future and losing their actual combat capability. India's defense system, built at a cost of $74.3 billion, has revealed a generational gap when compared to the combat system built by Pakistan. India's most prized weapons have been dissected, while China's HQ-9C already possesses the capability to intercept hypersonic weapons. The Wing Lung 3 drone can carry 16 precision munitions and maintain air superiority for 40 hours. The Fire Dragon tactical missiles launched by the PHL-191 rocket artillery system cover a range of 600 kilometers, easily striking Indian military airfields deep behind the lines. The Indian military is in a dilemma. Continuing to use weapons whose secrets have been exposed is tantamount to suicide, while a complete re-equipping would require astronomical funds. Of course, dismantling is just a small aspect. For China, it's insignificant. China is rapidly iterating at a pace of equipping one generation, researching one generation, and envisioning the next, while India is stuck in a dead loop of introduction, imitation, and stagnation. If this trend continues, India will find it even harder to fight. Indian military expert Praveen Soni warned that if China and India go to war, India would not last more than 10 days. Some might worry about India's previous announcement of obtaining a Chinese-made PEL-15E long-range air-to-air missile, and its claim to hand it over to countries like the US and Japan for research. Will this lead to the leakage of critical technology? The Indian website Asia Defense Security reported that New Delhi has allowed Japanese electronic warfare and radar technology experts to come to India to participate in the analysis of the PEL-15E air-to-air missile. Furthermore, this cooperation between Japan and India likely has the implicit approval of the US. The US has always been very interested in the performance of Chinese air-to-air missiles. The earliest warnings about the threat posed by the PL-15 and PL-17 missiles came from a US think tank. One reason the Pentagon urgently initiated the development of the AIM-260 Joint Advanced Tactical Missile with a range exceeding 200 kilometers in 2017 was their discovery that the maximum range of the full-spec, self-use version of the PL-15 missile might exceed 200 kilometers, far exceeding the US military's own AIM-120D missile. Even worse, above the PEL-15, the PLA also has the PL-17 long-range air-to-air missile. Analysis speculates that this missile's maximum range exceeds 400 kilometers, making it the world's longest-range air-to-air missile. This is also why the US military insists on putting the Standard 6 naval air defense missile on aircraft to create the so-called AIM-174B long-range air-to-air missile. So, the question is, what information can Japan extract from the wreckage collected by India? Ideally, if India can find a relatively complete PEL-15E missile, including key components like the Secr and warhead, then Japan can analyze the Secr structure to reverse engineer the PEL-15E Secr's operational logic. This information could then be used to improve Japanese and US air-to-air missile Secr designs, and to develop electronic countermeasures specifically against that Secr. This would allow the US, Japan, and India to find the Achilles heel of the PEL-15E air-to-air missile. Air-to-air missiles are most vulnerable to electronic jamming. If they truly develop this jamming equipment, the PEL-15E missile's combat hit rate will inevitably be affected. However, the problem Japan now faces is that India does not seem to have a complete Secr. Most of the wreckage they found consists of the rear section of the missile body left after the missile exploded or self-destructed. This section basically only contains the missile engine. Considering that the PEL-15E's engine has a unique dual-pulse design with intelligence value, and the US is not lacking in this type of technology, from the American perspective, any valuable parts on the wreckage would have been destroyed. The remaining parts are of very limited value to Japan. Perhaps only Indians would consider it a treasure. Furthermore, the PEL-15E, after all, is an export product. China must have considered the issue of leakage when selling it and would have performed corresponding desensitization treatments. So, what if Japan does develop jamming equipment? Only the PEL-15E would be affected, not the full-spec, self-use version of the PL-15. At a regular press conference held by China's Ministry of National Defense on May 29, spokesperson Zhang Zhaogang laughed when responding to a question about India obtaining an unexploded PEL-15E. A reporter asked whether China was concerned about India reverse engineering relevant military technology. Zhang Zhaogang simply laughed and said one sentence: "The missile you mentioned is an export product and has appeared multiple times at domestic and international defense exhibitions." What does this mean? It's telling India and other countries that there's no need for such trouble. The PEL-15E has long been exported, and they can simply buy one to conduct thorough research. There's no need to use a Rafale fighter jet, which costs up to $280 million, to crash into one. Additionally, Zhang Zhaogang specifically mentioned that India and Pakistan are China's unmovable neighbors. He hoped both sides would maintain calm. Perhaps the past 2 months have been quite a blow to India, and the Modi government has finally realized that it should improve relations with China. On July 15, Indian Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar attended the Council of Foreign Ministers of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in Tianjin. This was his first visit to China in 5 years. During his talks with Foreign Minister Wang Yi, Jaishankar stated that India values the hard-won improvements in bilateral relations and is willing to accelerate the resumption of cooperation mechanisms with China and jointly maintain peace and tranquility in the border areas. Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's visit to China received positive affirmation from China, and he made 3 major pledges in Beijing. Compared to the Morrison era, Australia has genuinely turned over a new leaf. On July 12, Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese arrived in Shanghai, beginning a 7-day visit to China. Australian media called this the longest visit to China by an Australian Prime Minister, with his itinerary spanning 3 cities, Beijing, Shanghai, and Chengdu. On July 15, Chinese leaders met with the visiting Albanese. China pointed out that bilateral relations have emerged from a low point in recent years, and the biggest lesson from this is that adhering to equality, seeking common ground while reserving differences, and mutually beneficial cooperation aligns with the fundamental interests of both China and Australia. Regardless of how the international situation changes, this general direction should be adhered to steadfastly. Some may still remember Australia's previous Prime Minister, a man named Scott Morrison. During his nearly 4 years in office, due to a series of unfriendly policies towards China, China-Australia relations plummeted. It wasn't until May 2022, when the pragmatic Albanese took office, that bilateral relations gradually stabilized and began to improve and develop. Last December, China lifted import restrictions on Australian lobster, and trade between the two countries basically returned to its normal state before 2017. Why? On one hand, Australia's economy couldn't sustain the pressure. On the other hand, China has consistently maintained an attitude of dialogue, not confrontation. As long as sincerity is shown, China is willing to engage in good discussions. From the data, Australia is highly dependent on the Chinese market. Since 2009, China has been Australia's largest trading partner for goods, import, source, and export market for 16 consecutive years. In 2024, bilateral trade reached 1.46 trillion RMB. A significant portion of Australian jobs also relies on trade with China, especially Australian specialties like iron ore, beef, and wine, with over 25% of exports flowing to China. In previous years, when China-Australia relations were tense, Australian lobster and coal exports were restricted, directly hurting the Australian economy. Now, Albanese, having just been re-elected, is eager to visit China, with a focus on economy and employment. What's more interesting is that Australia's visit to China also carries a subtle desire to counter the US. Recently, the US has been pressuring Australia to increase defense spending. The US Department of Defense has initiated a review of the AUKUS nuclear submarine agreement, aiming to assess whether the US should scrap the plan. These developments have made US-Australia relations even more delicate. In this context, Albanese's visit to China not only alleviates economic pressure, but also adds leverage to his diplomatic position. What did Albanese bring on this visit? He brought a lot of items on his cooperation list, covering trade, technology, tourism, education, security, sports, and film or television. Data from the Australian Bureau of Statistics shows that South Australia's exports to China reached a new high of $439 billion last year, with agricultural products like beef, wine, and lobster re-entering the Chinese market. For this visit, Albanese specifically brought senior executives from domestic banks, resource companies, higher education institutions, and the food industry. The goal is clear: to get China to continue buying, buy more, and buy long-term. Tourism is also an important area of China-Australia cooperation. China is Australia's largest source of tourists and international students. Albanese specifically mentioned expanding tourism relations in Shanghai. 3 key pledges in Beijing. For Albanese's statements in Beijing, 3 key pledges are noteworthy. Australia does not seek economic decoupling from China. China is Australia's largest trading partner, with nearly a quarter of its trade volume coming from China-Australia trade, and nearly a third of its exports relying on China, especially critical iron ore exports. During a luncheon with Chinese and Australian business leaders in Shanghai, Albanese emphasized that iron ore is a pillar industry in Australia, directly providing over 60,000 jobs, and China is Australia's largest iron ore customer, with half of its imported iron ore coming from Australia. Before departing for China, Albanese also stated in a media interview that China-Australia trade is now unimpeded, which is good for both countries. The series of countermeasures taken by China in previous years still leaves the Albanese government wary. His Labour Party was able to secure re-election in May this year, with a significant victory over conservative rivals in the Senate, not only due to indirect assistance from Trump, but also due to Australia's stable economic development in recent years. For a vast and sparsely populated country like Australia, economic problems are not complex. If it doesn't mess around with China, many problems can be easily resolved. It can be said that Australia, having learned from the lessons of the previous government, has now genuinely turned over a new leaf. Therefore, we can also see that China did not hesitate to affirm the Albanese government's promotion and development of China-Australia relations in recent years. Australia adheres to the One China policy and does not support Taiwan independence. The Albanese government has consistently maintained this stance without change. However, when viewed in conjunction with the recent event, it becomes very interesting. The Financial Times recently reported that the U.S. Department of Defense has been frequently pressuring Japanese and Australian officials to clarify their responses in the event of a conflict in the Taiwan Strait, demanding a precise statement. In response, Australian Defence Industry Minister Pat Conroy stated last Sunday when asked by reporters that Australia would not make prior commitments to deploy troops in any conflict and would prioritize its national sovereignty. The U.S. Department of Defense has not denied this matter to date, making it essentially a confirmed fact. The U.S. military's current questioning is likely related to the so-called 2027 scenario. Trump does not want the U.S. military to get involved, but this issue is far more complex than Russia or the Middle East and requires advanced planning. Hence, the questions to Japan and Australia. Among U.S. allies in Asia, Japan and Australia, one to the north and one to the south, are 2 unsinkable aircraft carriers and China's most loyal allies. If these 2 countries do not want to get involved, then the U.S. probably won't find anyone else. Recently, Trump has not only demanded that Australia increase its military spending, but also threatened to increase tariffs on Australian products. Some America First double standards have severely harmed Australian interests. Realizing that the U.S. cannot be relied upon, the consumption dividends brought by China to Australia are far more substantial than the U.S.'s deterrence. If Australia were to decouple from the U.S., the Australian public would be the first to object. Australia supports China hosting the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation APEC Summit in 2026. This is easy to understand. Barring any surprises, Albanese will likely visit China again next year, making it his third visit within 3 years. Interestingly, according to foreign media reports, Albanese mentioned the acquisition of Darwin Port during his meeting with Chinese leaders. To avoid disrupting the atmosphere of the highest-level dialogue, Albanese made a very rational and wise choice. Albanese had publicly stated during his election campaign that he would strive to reclaim the port if re-elected, even suggesting nationalization if no buyer could be found. However, from the current outcome, Australia's request has been dashed. In the China-Australia Joint Outcome Statement, there is a declaration stating, "Both sides recognize the importance of a fair, open, and non-discriminatory business environment." This point is precisely the reasonable demand that China has frequently mentioned when responding to the Darwin Port issue in the past. It appears that China has not made concessions on the Darwin Port issue. Even if Australia intended to reclaim it early, it is now out of the question. Furthermore, from Australia's series of actions at this stage, it can actually be seen that, as the leader of Australia, Albanese has a clear understanding of the core contradictions of national interests. Between the political declaration of the so-called reclaiming the port and the realistic need to maintain trade with China, he clearly prefers the latter. Darwin Port is leased by the Chinese company Landbridge Group for a period of 99 years. Although some politicians have been hyping up so-called security risks over the years, in actual operation, it mainly involves logistics and port services. After several investigations, no substantial threat to Australia's national security has been found. Moreover, if Australia wants to reclaim it early, it would have to bear huge breach of contract fees, possibly amounting to billions of Australian dollars, and it would trigger legal disputes, damaging Australia's international image. What's more, for the Labour government led by Albanese, their priority is to address domestic economic challenges, such as inflation and slowing economic growth. If China-Australia trade were to suffer setbacks, Australia would face problems such as obstructed energy exports and falling prices, which would directly lead to reduced fiscal revenue, industry contraction, and consequently affect people's livelihoods and welfare, weakening the government's approval rating. Conversely, the controversy surrounding the reclamation of Darwin Port is more of a political manipulation by domestic conservatives, while most economists and business people believe that the investment and employment brought by port operations should be considered actual benefits. Rashly reclaiming it could also provoke opposition from this segment of the population. It is no exaggeration to say that this incident has become a litmus test for China-Australia relations in recent years. If Albanese doesn't know how to handle it, then maintaining the status quo and not proactively raising the issue with China, letting it quietly pass, might be the best approach.